on a history of the Navy in 100 objects, we are returning to an older age of exploration, a time when the Pacific coast of North America, Antarctica, and much of the Pacific was still uncharted territory to the young United States. This piece of a naval officer's uniform symbolizes the role of the U.S. Navy in exploration and scientific research.
The hat you see right here to my right is on the first deck of Preble Hall, the Naval Academy Museum. It's called a bicorn. Now, from our elementary school classes, we might remember what a tricorn was during the American Revolution. It was simply a hat with 3 corners. A bicorn simply had 2 sides. It was worn either side to side, like you would have seen with Napoleon in some of the famous portraits of him, or it was worn in the naval fashion, more often than not, fore to aft. In this case, bicorn was sometimes used, it could be folded and slipped under the arm to be carried by a naval officer. This bicorn was owned by Charles Wilkes, later Commodore Charles Wilkes, and retired an admiral on the retired list. Wilkes is probably most famous for the Wilkes Expedition, which he commanded from 1838 to 1842. The purpose of the South Seas Exploring Expedition was to take 6 ships and scientific personnel, taxidermists, naturalists, etc., and survey the Pacific Northwest coast, as well as most of the Pacific. The reason why is because American commerce was expanding throughout the Pacific during the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and they really needed to know where could merchant ships go, where were the shoals, where were the reefs, where were the islands. So he commands the fleet of 6 ships for 4 years, concludes in 1842, and it is not an easy time. There are battles on a few Pacific islands. He is court-martialing a number of his officers. He himself is court-martialed when he returns because he was known as somewhat of a difficult leader. Wilkes is also known for Wilkes Land on Antarctica. He claims finding Antarctica during his travels. Why is this important? Number one, the immediate effect is that a lot of the items they brought back from the South Seas were brought to Washington, D.C. and incorporated into the Smithsonian Institution. So a lot of the older items they have are from the Wilkes Expedition. What else did they do as a result of this 87,000-mile journey? 100 years later, at the outbreak of World War II, the United States knows that it's going to conduct an island hopping campaign across the Pacific to deal with the Japanese. The problem was they didn't have modern maps. So they reverted back to the National Archives and they pulled the maps and charts and surveys from the Wilkes Expedition to know exactly where the islands were, where the reefs were, where there were potential harbors. And so the Wilkes Expedition actually has an effect for almost 100 years.
Charles Wilkes was chosen to lead the United States Exploring Expedition because of his experience working with civilian scientists and his familiarity with oceanographic surveying. He set sail on August 19, 1838. Over the next 4 years, the Wilkes Expedition traveled to Australia, the Antarctic Ocean, the Hawaiian Islands, Fiji, the west coast of North America, the Philippines, and all the routes in between. He returned to New York via the Cape of Good Hope on June 10, 1842. It was the last all-sail naval mission to completely encircle the globe. The Wilkes Expedition played a major role in the development of 19th century science. 280 islands, mostly in the Pacific, were explored, as well as over 800 miles of Oregon coast. Over 60,000 plant and bird specimens were collected. The Wilkes Expedition led the way for the growth of the American scientific establishment, with the U.S. Navy making that growth possible. Thanks for joining us for a history of the Navy in 100 objects. We hope to see you soon at the U.S. Naval Academy Museum.